A young man kneels in the dust of the Elah Valley. Above him, two armies wait in a paralyzed standoff on opposite ridges, and fires a lucky pebble into the air. God then miraculously intervenes, overriding physics, and steers the tiny rock like a guided missile. The slinger must let go of the slipcord at the exact millisecond the pouch reaches the optimal point in its arc. If a slinger releases the cord a fraction of a second too early, the stone launches harmlessly into the sky. If they hold on a fraction of a second too late, the stone slams violently into the dirt at their own feet. There are no sights on a sling. There is no physical aiming mechanism. The only way to hit a target accurately is through deeply ingrained muscle memory neural pathways built through thousands of hours of relentless, solitary repetition. This completely changes how we view David's confidence. When he refused Saul's heavy armor, he was not acting recklessly. He was not a naive, foolish boy expecting a magical intervention to guide a clumsy, random throw. He was a highly trained marksman stepping into his natural element. The Keilah was a physical extension of his own body. God did not have to magically fix David's aim in the valley. God was partnering with the quiet, unseen, grueling preparation David had already completed. Yet, no matter how skilled the slinger is, the ancient battlefield remains a chaotic and unpredictable place. The wind shifts in the valley. Targets move. Even a master slinger can miss. Which brings us to a specific detail in the text that is often either overly romanticized or entirely misunderstood: to strike the one vulnerable square inch on the giant's forehead. It is a comforting version of the story. When David was kneeling by the streambed, he did not just select one perfect stone. He selected exactly 5. If he was so confident in his skill and so absolutely certain of God's deliverance, why did he need backup ammunition? Did his faith waver at the last second, or does that specific number reveal something profoundly different about his mindset as he walked out to face the giant? The 5 stones rest at the bottom of the leather pouch, clicking softly against each other with every step the young shepherd takes toward the battle line. For centuries, readers have tried to explain exactly why David picked up 5. A popular tradition suggests he chose 5 because Goliath had 4 giant brothers. It is a clever idea. But the biblical text in 1 Samuel never mentions Goliath's relatives being present in the valley that day. Others argue that the 5 stones reveal a subtle crack in David's theology, a hidden lack of faith. They suggest that if he truly trusted God, he would have only picked up 1. By picking up 5, he was creating a contingency plan, hedging his bets, just in case God did not deliver on the first throw. But that interpretation fundamentally misunderstands both ancient warfare and the nature of biblical faith. David is not acting out of doubt. He is acting out of lethal readiness. He is a trained slinger walking into an active combat zone, but it completely ignores the historical reality of the ancient world. The problem is not that the biblical account is exaggerated. You do not enter a battlefield with a single round of ammunition simply to prove a theological point. You bring a full supply, because your objective is to eliminate the threat completely. The 5 stones do not represent a lack of trust. They represent his absolute, calculated resolve. He is prepared to load, spin, and fire as many times as necessary until the enemy of Israel is dead on the ground. This is not a boy hoping for a magic trick. This is a warrior fully confident in his covenant with God, utilizing the ordinary tools he has mastered. We see this exact confidence in the exchange of words that echoes across the valley. Goliath looks down at the shepherd, sees the wooden walking stick, and feels insulted. He curses David by his gods, demanding the boy step forward, so his flesh can be fed to the birds and the wild animals. David does not flinch. He shouts back, a response that reorients the entire battlefield. You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Notice what David is doing. He is entirely shifting the scale of the conflict. Goliath believes this is a contest of physical dominance, a heavy infantry champion against an unarmored peasant. Saul believed this was a contest of military technology. The problem is that we misunderstand the weapon. And because we misunderstand the weapon, we fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the victory. Bronze armor against bronze armor. But David recognizes the true nature of the confrontation. This is not David against Goliath. This is Goliath against Yahweh. And in that contest, the giant's armor is completely irrelevant. David understands that the God who commands the armies of heaven does not require Israel to use the weapons of empires. He only requires a faithful, available vessel. The shepherd's confidence is not in the stones themselves, nor is it ultimately in his own muscle memory. His confidence is in the covenant. God has promised to defend his people, and David is simply volunteering to be the physical mechanism through which that defense is executed. The theological stakes are set. The historical context is clear. The weapons have been chosen. The talking stops. The paralyzing standoff that held the valley of Elah captive for 40 agonizing days is finally over. The massive Philistine champion lowers his helmet and begins to lumber forward, expecting to crush the boy in close combat. In response, David does not stand still, and he does not retreat. He reaches into his pouch, pulls out a single smooth stone, and begins to sprint directly toward the battle line. The two combatants are now rushing headlong toward each other. And this is where the physical geometry of the battle completely changes. David was not holding a toy. He was holding a piece of elite, devastating military artillery. The weapon in his hand was not a Y-shaped piece of wood. The dust of the valley floor kicks up as Goliath lumbers forward. He is carrying well over 100 pounds of interlocking bronze armor, not including the massive wooden shaft of his spear. A shield bearer walks ahead of him, providing an additional wall of defense. Goliath is the ultimate expression of heavy infantry, and his entire strategy depends on one specific condition: he must close the distance. That is why his final taunt was an invitation to close combat. "Come to me," he bellowed, expecting the young shepherd to walk blindly into the lethal, sweeping radius of his iron-tipped weapon. In a sword fight, the larger, heavier, better armored man almost always wins. But David has already rejected the rules of heavy infantry when he left Saul's armor lying in the dirt of the royal tent, unburdened by bronze. The young shepherd is terrifyingly fast. The biblical text notes that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. He is rapidly closing the gap, but he never intends to enter the giant's striking distance. While still in a full sprint, David reaches into his bag, pulls out one of the 5 smooth river stones, and drops it into the leather pouch of the keilah. He raises his arm, powered by elastic bands. Elastic rubber would not be invented for thousands of years. David was carrying an ancient shepherd's sling, a weapon of rotational kinetic energy, and the cords begin to spin. Imagine the sensory reality of the valley. The metallic clanking of the giant's armor, the heavy thud of his boots, and above it all, the sudden, low, tearing hum of leather cutting through the air. The rotational kinetic energy builds exponentially with every revolution. The stone is no longer a harmless river rock. It has become a lethal projectile, loaded with massive concussive force. At the precise microsecond, guided by years of unseen muscle memory and absolute covenant confidence, David releases the slip cord. The stone explodes forward at over 70 miles per hour. It crosses the remaining distance before Goliath even has time to register the threat, let alone raise his heavy shield or swing his spear. Given the terrifying buildup of the previous 40 days, we might expect a long, drawn-out, cinematic duel. We expect a clash of titans. But the biblical writer describes the climax with a stunning narrative understatement. There is no epic exchange of blows. There is no desperate struggle. The text simply states, the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. That is it. The confrontation is over in a single sentence. The terrifying, monumental power that held an entire nation paralyzed with fear is dismantled, constructed from woven wool or leather cords. In the hands of a trained user, it was a weapon capable of shattering a human skull in a fraction of a second. The invincible champion does not even manage to swing his weapon. He is struck with such sudden, blunt force trauma that he collapses instantly. And notice his posture. He does not fall backward. He falls face forward into the dirt, a posture of complete, involuntary submission before the God of Israel. The massive system of intimidation, advanced technology, and sheer physical dominance was completely subverted by a shepherd using speed, distance, and a piece of leather. It is a stunning, paradigm-shifting victory. The giant is dead, and the Israelite army surges forward with a massive shout. But the longer we look at the fallen champion and the ordinary weapon that brought him down, the more we realize something profound. This specific victory was won in the Elah Valley. But the mechanism of that victory points to a much larger rhythm in how God operates in history. David's sling is not an isolated incident. It is not an anomaly. It is part of a grand, unmistakable architectural pattern woven through the entirety of Scripture. Step back and look at the architecture of the biblical narrative. Once the pattern becomes visible, the story of the Elah Valley reads entirely differently. David's choice of the sling is not an isolated, clever military tactic. It is a fundamental law of how God operates in human history, denting bronze armor and dropping a charging predator in its tracks. When the young shepherd stepped out from the ranks of the terrified Israelite army, God consistently bypasses the monumental to weaponize the ordinary. This is not the first time the pattern appears. Centuries earlier, an exiled shepherd stood before a burning bush. Terrified at the command to confront the Pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful imperial ruler on earth, God did not hand him a royal sword or a chariot of iron. Instead, God asked a simple, piercing question: "What is in your hand?" The answer was a dead piece of wood, a shepherd's staff. And with that ordinary piece of wood, Moses split the sea and dismantled an empire. The pattern repeats violently through the book of Judges. When Shamgar faced a Philistine invasion, he did not have an armory of heavy weapons. He picked up an ox goad, a long wooden stick used to drive cattle, and struck down 600 men. When the Canaanite general Sisera terrorized Israel with 900 chariots of iron, the monumental military power of the enemy was not defeated by another army. It was defeated by a woman named Jael. When the general fled to her tent, she did not reach for a soldier's spear. She reached for the domestic tools she used every single day, a wooden tent peg and a workman's hammer. When Samson was surrounded by 1,000 Philistine warriors, he did not forge a bronze sword. He did not bring a weak weapon to a sword fight. He brought a high-velocity, long-range projectile to a close-quarters brawl. He reached into the dirt and picked up the jawbone of a donkey, a staff, an ox goad, a tent peg, a jawbone, a leather sling, and a smooth river stone. Notice what keeps repeating. None of these are conventional military weapons. They are agricultural tools. They are domestic equipment. They are the ordinary, unremarkable objects of everyday life. This is not a coincidence. It is a deliberate theological statement against human pride. We spend so much of our lives wishing we had different resources. We look at the giants standing in our own valleys, the massive, imposing obstacles, the cultural pressures, the prolonged illnesses, the overwhelming fears, and we assume we need monumental power to defeat them. We think we need the institutional backing of a King Saul. We believe we must acquire the heavy bronze armor of the world to survive. We beg God for a sword, convinced that our ordinary lives and meager resources are insufficient for the battle. But God does not need our advanced technology, and He refuses to wear the world's armor. He weaponizes the ordinary things already in our hands, provided they are entirely surrendered to Him. This truth is a profound comfort. But it also raises a deeply personal question. God uses the ordinary, but He does not bypass. Which brings us to the central question. If David was actually carrying a lethal weapon, why do we think of him as defenseless? Our need for discipline. David's sling was an everyday tool. But as we have seen, it was not easy to use. It required perfect timing, immense focus, and lethal biomechanical precision. If God wants to use what is already in our hands, how do we acquire the skill to use it effectively when the crisis suddenly arrives? David did not have time to practice his aim. Once Goliath started running toward him, the crisis did not create his readiness, it merely exposed it. To understand how we survive the valley, we have to look away from the battlefield. We have to return to the lonely place where David actually learned to use the weapon in the first place. Section 8. The hidden years of preparation long before the Valley of Elah. There was the wilderness of Judea. It is a harsh, unforgiving landscape of steep limestone ravines, blistering midday heat, and profound isolation. This is where David spent his youth. There were no cheering crowds on the ridges. There was no royal audience waiting to reward him. There were only wandering sheep, endless silence, and the terrifying, sudden movement of a predator in the brush. When David tried to convince King Saul to let him fight Goliath, he did not point to a royal military academy. He pointed to his hidden years, the air heavy with the metallic sound of shifting armor and the echoes of a single, terrifying voice. Below him, the streambed is completely quiet. More importantly, why did he choose a sling instead of a sword? And what does this ordinary piece of technology reveal about how God confronts monumental power? He told the terrified king about the times a lion or a bear had come to carry off a sheep from the flock. He had pursued them, struck them, and rescued the lamb from their teeth. We read that account and see instantaneous heroism, but we completely overlook the grueling, boring repetition that made those rescues possible. Mastery of the Keilah is not granted through a sudden impartation of skill. It demands thousands of hours of deliberate practice. It requires throwing smooth stones at tree trunks, at distant rocks, at nothing but the empty horizon. Day after day, year after year. David did not learn to defeat monumental threats in the spotlight. He learned to defeat them in the shadows, defending a flock when absolutely no one was watching. This is where the ancient text confronts our modern lives. We live in a world that worships the public stage. We want the cinematic victory in the valley. But we fiercely resent the isolation of the pasture. We hate the hidden seasons. We view delays, obscurity, and repetitive, mundane responsibilities as evidence that God has sidelined us. We beg to be given Saul's armor so we can finally look important. Ask yourself, what have you mistaken for a useless delay? This is not ultimately a story about a miraculous, lucky shot compensating for weakness. It is a story about how God uses overlooked. What are you trying to escape that God is actually using to prepare you? Perhaps you are working an uncelebrated, exhausting job. Perhaps you are quietly caring for an aging parent, changing diapers in the early hours of the morning, or fighting a lonely, private battle to heal from a deep trauma. It feels like you are doing nothing of consequence. It feels like you are just throwing stones at trees in the dark. But the hidden season is not a waiting room, it is a training ground. You are building the spiritual and emotional muscle memory of faithfulness. Every time you choose integrity when no one is watching, every time you offer a prayer when heaven feels silent, every time you do the quiet, unglamorous work of daily obedience, you are loading the pouch. You are learning the biomechanics of trust. God uses the quiet, repetitive obscurity of our lives to forge the exact spiritual skills we will need for our future valleys. This is why David did not need Saul's heavy bronze. He had already acquired something far more valuable in the wilderness, a tested, intimate knowledge of God's faithfulness. The terrifying crisis of Goliath did not miraculously transform a weak, unprepared boy into a warrior, faithfully prepared tools to dismantle overwhelming human force. Look at the physical geometry of the valley. For 40 days, the Philistine champion has paralyzed the armies of Israel. The crisis merely revealed the quiet readiness that the wilderness had already produced. Your ordinary obedience in the shadows is never wasted. Your unseen preparation is known to the God of the armies of Israel. But there is one final, ultimate layer to this narrative that stretches far beyond a shepherd and a giant. To understand the complete architectural design of this battle, we have to look away from the slinger. We have to look closely at the physical object that actually struck the fatal blow. The stone that sank into the giant's forehead secured the victory in the Elah Valley. But the echoes of that impact resonate through the rest of the Bible. That small, smooth piece of rock is not just the weapon of a shepherd, it is a prophetic image of how God ultimately redeems the world. Hundreds of years after David, the prophet Daniel interpreted a terrifying dream for a Babylonian king. In the dream, the king saw a monumental statue, made of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. It represented the crushing, heavy infantry of human empires. But that massive image was not destroyed by a larger statue or a greater army. It was destroyed by a single stone, cut out by no human hand. The stone struck the iron feet of the statue. The monumental power collapsed into dust, and the stone grew into a mountain that filled the whole earth. The pattern remains unbroken. He is a master of heavy infantry combat, relying on massive size, psychological terror, and the sheer weight of his technology. God brings down the terrifying, towering empires of the world using a stone that human logic completely overlooks. Centuries later, the ultimate fulfillment of this pattern arrived, but he did not come wearing heavy armor. Jesus of Nazareth stepped into the ultimate valley to face the ultimate giants of sin and death. The religious and political leaders of his day expected a conventional conqueror. They wanted a Messiah wrapped in the bronze of a new King Saul to violently overthrow the Romans. Instead, Jesus arrived in total, willing vulnerability. Because he did not match their expectations of monumental power, they discarded him. As the New Testament declares, he became the stone that the builders rejected. But in the brilliant, subversive architecture of God, that rejected stone became the chief cornerstone. At the cross, Jesus did not use the weapons of the world. He allowed the world's heavy infantry to strike him. And through that profound sacrifice, he shattered the power of death forever. Which brings us all the way back to a cold stream bed in the valley of Elah. A young man kneels in the dust. He reaches his bare hand into the rushing water and carefully selects a smooth, dense river rock. At the beginning of our study, we thought we were looking at a primitive toy, a symbol of a helpless boy desperately hoping for a miraculous intervention. Now, we see something entirely different. We see the lethal precision of quiet, hidden preparation. We see the total rejection of human institutional power. The Israelites are trying to play by his rules. They are measuring their own conventional strength against his conventional strength. We see the devastating kinetic energy of a covenant promise. This is not a story about how you need to find a magical pebble to solve your problems. It is a story about the God who takes the ordinary, overlooked, faithfully surrendered pieces of your life and weaponizes them to bring down giants. When you are standing in your own valley, paralyzed by the sheer size of the threat in front of you, the world will demand that you put on its armor. The culture will tell you that you must match the enemy's scale, adopt the enemy's tactics, and rely on your own manufactured strength. Leave the heavy armor in the tent. Walk out with what God has already placed in your hand. The giant is not expecting you, and the giant is already falling. If this journey through the Elah Valley helped you see Scripture with more clarity, consider subscribing and sharing this study with someone who is facing their own giant right now, and they are terrified because the math does not work in their favor. David refuses to play the giant's game. He reaches into the riverbed and pulls out a smooth stone. In a matter of minutes, that ordinary stone will become an instrument of divine subversion. We often think David brought a pebble to a spear fight. The historical truth is much closer to the opposite. But if the sling was such a powerful weapon, why was Goliath so violently confident? What did the giant, the Israelite king, and both terrified armies fail to understand? As the shepherd walked down into the valley, to comprehend the true stakes of this confrontation, we must first look at the brutal military reality of ancient warfare. He reaches a bare hand into the dirt and begins to search the dry riverbed. His fingers brush past rough gravel and jagged rocks. If you walked onto a battlefield in the ancient Near East, You would not find a disorganized mob of men swinging swords. Ancient warfare was a highly structured, lethal science. To understand what actually happened in the Valley of Elah, we have to look at the three primary categories of ancient military power. First, there was the cavalry, or the chariots, the ancient equivalent of tanks, designed for speed and breaking enemy lines. Second, there was the heavy infantry. These were the foot soldiers equipped with swords, spears, shields, and heavy armor. They were built for close quarters, hand-to-hand combat. Goliath of Gath was the ultimate heavy infantryman. He was a massive, walking fortress of bronze. He stood in the valley, expecting the Israelites to send out their own heavy infantryman to fight him on his own terms. But there was a third category of ancient warrior, the light artillery. This group included archers and slingers. And in the ancient world, slingers were the ancient equivalent of snipers. Historical records from antiquity reveal just how terrifying these units were. Centuries later, the Roman army would employ specialized slingers who used a weapon called a funda. The ancient Balearic slingers of the Mediterranean were so precise they were said to be able to hit a specific facial feature of an enemy from hundreds of feet away. They were not peasants making do with cheap tools, until he finds exactly what he is looking for. A smooth stone, heavy, dense, perfectly rounded by centuries of rushing water. They were highly sought-after mercenaries who could turn the tide of a war. The weapon itself is a masterpiece of devastating physics. A sling essentially acts as an extension of the human arm. By spinning the leather pouch, the slinger creates a massive lever, building up immense rotational kinetic energy. When one cord is released at the precise microsecond, the projectile does not just fall forward, it explodes out of the pouch. Historians and ballistics experts have calculated that an ancient slinger could launch a dense stone at speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour. At that velocity, a quarter-pound rock carries the stopping power of a modern handgun bullet. This explains exactly why David was searching the riverbed for a very specific type of ammunition. He was not looking for jagged rocks, because jagged rocks catch the wind. An uneven surface creates aerodynamic drag, causing the projectile to veer wildly off course. But a smooth, dense riverstone, it flies perfectly straight. It retains its velocity, and when it strikes, it transfers all of its kinetic energy directly into the target. This is the hidden contradiction of the battle. Goliath is covered in heavy bronze scales. That armor is brilliantly designed to deflect the slicing edge of a sword or the thrust of a spear. But it is practically useless. He weighs it in his palm, drops it into a small leather pouch, finds 4 more just like it, and stands up to face a monster against the blunt force trauma of a high-velocity projectile. A heavy, smooth stone, traveling at 70 miles per hour, does not need to pierce the armor. If it strikes a bronze helmet, the concussive force alone is enough to fracture the skull beneath it. David was not relying on a miracle to make a weak weapon strong. He was bringing a devastating, long-range weapon to a man, expecting a fistfight. The physical reality of the ancient sling is undeniable, but that reality creates an entirely new problem in the biblical narrative. David was not a professional mercenary. He was not a trained Roman sniper or a drafted soldier in the Israelite artillery. He was a shepherd. If the sling was such a lethal piece of military hardware, why was this specific shepherd carrying one onto a battlefield of armored champions? The answer lies in a profound contrast of technologies, a contrast that begins not on the bloody front line of the valley, but in the quiet, terrified tent of Israel's king. Inside the king's tent, the air is thick with desperation. King Saul has finally found a volunteer willing to face the Philistine champion, but he knows he cannot send an unprotected shepherd onto the battlefield. The optics would be humiliating, and the outcome seems certain. It is the most famous underdog story in human history, and almost every time we tell it, we get the central image wrong. So, the king attempts to do what institutional power always does in a crisis. He tries to manufacture a conventional soldier. According to the text, Saul clothes David in his own armor. He places a heavy bronze helmet on his head and covers his chest with a coat of mail. Finally, he straps his own royal sword to the young man's waist. We usually read this scene as a moment of light-hearted comedy. We picture a small boy drowning in oversized clothes, clanking around the tent awkwardly while the seasoned warriors watch in amusement. But this is not a comedy. It is a profound theological tragedy. Saul is attempting to turn David into a smaller version of Goliath. Remember why Saul was chosen as Israel's first king in the first place. The book of 1 Samuel explicitly notes that Saul stood head and shoulders above everyone else in the nation. He was chosen precisely because he looked like a heavy infantry champion. He was supposed to be Israel's monumental answer to the towering threats of the surrounding nations. But Saul's monumental power has failed, paralyzed by fear. The king has refused to enter the valley himself. Instead, he tries to transfer his failed strategy onto the next generation. Saul believes that the only way— we all know the common interpretation. We picture a small, defenseless boy holding a primitive wooden slingshot, the kind of toy a child might use. To defeat conventional power is to wear conventional armor. He assumes victory requires matching the enemy's technology and playing by the enemy's rules. David tries to walk. The weight of the interlocking bronze plates presses down on his shoulders. The helmet restricts his peripheral vision. The armor is not just physically heavy, it is the psychological burden of a terrified system. If David walks into the valley wearing Saul's armor, he is accepting Goliath's terms of engagement. He will be fighting as a second-rate heavy infantryman. And in that kind of fight, the larger man always wins. Then David makes a decision that changes the course of biblical history. He stops walking. He looks at the king and says, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." He strips the armor off. The heavy bronze hits the dirt floor of the tent. This is the central contrast of the narrative playing out in real time. This is not ultimately a story about borrowing someone else's strength to survive. It is a story about the courage to remain ordinary when the world demands that you look formidable. David is rejecting the false security of human institutional power. He is choosing the mobility of the shepherd over the rigid constraints of the soldier. He walks out of the tent exactly as he entered it. He wears a simple woven tunic. He carries a wooden shepherd's staff to chase birds away from a garden. We imagine him walking onto the battlefield trembling, facing a hardened veteran encased in over 100 pounds. He holds a leather sling. He has traded the best military technology of his day for total vulnerability. He is leaving the tent completely exposed. A single strike from a spear will kill him instantly. He has no shield to deflect an incoming attack and no bronze to protect his chest. To the armies watching from the ridge, it looks like a suicide mission. Why would a sane person abandon impenetrable armor for a piece of leather and a few river stones? The answer lies not in magic, but in mechanics. To understand David's overwhelming confidence as he steps out into the sunlight, we have to look closely at the weapon he refused to leave behind. We have to examine the precise ancient mechanics of the tool in his hand. David walks out of the royal tent carrying practically nothing. No wooden shield, no bronze breastplate, no iron sword. He holds only a wooden staff in one hand, and in the other, a small, unassuming bundle of leather and cords. To the heavily armed soldiers watching from the ridge, it looks like a scrap of shepherd's gear, but the ancient biblical writers used a specific word to describe what he was carrying down into the valley: of interlocking bronze armor. In our popular imagination, David is completely outmatched. We assume he closes his eyes, swings his little toy. In the original Hebrew, the weapon is called the kilah. The English translation sling unfortunately carries the baggage of our modern world. We hear the word and immediately imagine a casual, improvised plaything. But in the ancient Near East, the kilah was a highly specialized instrument of ballistics. It was typically constructed from a small central pouch made of leather or woven wool, attached to two long cords of animal sinew or tightly braided flax. One cord was tied securely around the slinger's wrist or index finger. The other cord ended in a knot. designed to be pinched between the thumb and forefinger so it could slip free at the critical moment. The true power of the Kela was not found in the raw materials it was made of. It was found in the biomechanics required to fire it. A bronze sword relies on brute strength. A spear relies on forward momentum. But the sling relies on something far more difficult to master: perfect microsecond timing. To operate the sling, a user places a dense, smooth stone into the pouch. They begin to rotate it rapidly, often in a figure-8 motion, or directly above the head, building immense rotational kinetic energy. As the speed increases, the air itself begins to tear, creating a low, terrifying hum. The longer the cords, the greater the resulting velocity. But building the speed is the easy part. The defining mechanism of the Kela is the release.